Hey guys! Tonight we begin with a slow drift back into a time that makes modern life feel like a spa retreat. So grab a blanket, dim the lights, maybe pour yourself a cup of something warm, and let's meander through the slightly odd, often miserable, yet somehow endlessly fascinating lives of people who lived hundreds of years ago. Let's float back, not too fast, to the medieval world. Picture it. Streets that are basically mud rivers, and everyone smells like they've been baking in the sun for a few centuries. No deodorant, very little hygiene, and somehow people thought this was perfectly normal. Oh, the charm. You would wake up, probably with lice in your hair, and immediately start your day digging, hauling, or weaving because that's what survival looked like in 1325. It wasn't glamorous, but it was consistent. Now, imagine being a peasant. Your morning doesn't begin with a coffee and some ambient Spotify playlist. No, it begins with a bucket of cold water, maybe clean, maybe full of something else, and the sense that you will probably not make it through the day without some minor disaster. And of course, your breakfast is whatever your neighbors can spare, which is sometimes more like whatever hasn't gone off in the last week. But hey, at least there's bread, right? Slightly moldy bread, but bread nonetheless. Floating gently over to the elite, because, let's be honest, the royals' lives were equally strange, but for different reasons. There's a lot of power, yes, but also a lot of weird rules, forced marriages, and titles that sound impressive until you realize half of Europe was claiming to be someone's cousin in some way. Take King Charles VI of France, for instance. He was called the Beloved early on, which seems kind of ironic because later he earned the nickname Charles the Mad. Not exactly a marketing choice you'd want on your LinkedIn profile. He would sometimes wander the palace hallways dressed as a commoner, or sometimes just stand in corners muttering to himself. And of course, the court loved this, because why not double down on a little chaos? And while we're floating over this royal disaster, let's glance at the Habsburgs. Yes, the same family that has enough portraits of themselves to fill a museum, all showing off very similar noses and jawlines. Inbreeding was apparently considered an aesthetic, or maybe just convenient. Either way, they called one of their members the Handsome, which, judging by the portraits, looked more like a half-baked potato with a fancy wig. Charming, really. As we wander slowly through these dynasties, you notice patterns. People married young, usually because someone told them to. They developed weird obsessions with food, gardens, and pets, sometimes all at once. And yes, emotional meltdowns were apparently a legitimate form of communication. You might find a queen throwing herself on the floor because her favorite tapestry wasn't aligned with the sunlight, or a duke who refused to eat anything but a very specific kind of cheese, and woe betide the servant who brought the wrong one. Now, floating over to the daily life of the ordinary folk again, because the contrast is delightfully tragic. Imagine waking up, trying to get some work done, and literally hoping that your neighbor doesn't accidentally trample your crops. Because medieval villages were very small, and personal space was considered a suggestion. Most people slept in communal spaces with animals for warmth, or at least for the illusion of warmth, so your nightly dreams were a mix of sheep, pigs, and occasional nightmares of taxes. And speaking of taxes, the medieval tax system was a treat. Lords would often tax based on what you didn't even know you owned. Maybe you had a goat, tax it. Maybe you had some slightly damp hay, tax it too. And then there were tithes, which was basically the church saying, hey, give us a tenth of everything you own, thanks. But don't worry, they'd make it sound very spiritual. If you were a peasant, you'd look at all this and think, well, at least I'm still alive. Survival was the main hobby. Now, floating gently back to the elites, let's consider King Henry VIII's distant ancestors. They were charming in their own way. If you consider obsessive hunting, elaborate hats, and marrying for land rather than love charming. It's interesting to note that every single royal seemed to have a hobby, mostly consisting of riding horses or decorating castles with things that didn't necessarily make sense, like gold-plated chairs shaped like lions. And yes, they were all very serious about it. You wouldn't dare sit in a golden lion chair unless someone invited, mostly because someone could get offended, or worse, because it might collapse. And here's something delightful. Mental health was not really a thing. Kings and queens, dukes and duchesses all had quirks that today would land them multiple therapy sessions. Instead, back then, it was often explained as either divine will or occasionally witchcraft. So a king wandering the halls muttering about invisible enemies? Totally normal. The court just nodded along politely and kept passing him cheese platters. At this point, it's worth taking a slow breath, maybe stretch a little, and imagine being a child in these families. Not your regular bedtime stories. No, there is involved learning how to survive intrigue, avoid poisoning, though let's be honest, accidents happened, and somehow figure out how to look impressive in portraits for the future. And as we drift through these centuries, you begin to notice a comforting pattern. No one really had it all together. The royals, the peasants, the nobles, everyone was a little off kilter. And maybe that's why history is so soothing to read at night. Because no matter how chaotic your life feels, someone, somewhere was probably wearing a potato wig and calling it fashion. Or complaining that the sun hit their castle at the wrong angle.
Back into the medieval world, where the ground is mud, the water is questionable, and the idea of a shower is, well, non-existent. Imagine waking up in a tiny room, maybe shared with your siblings, maybe shared with your goat, and definitely shared with some fleas. And then you realize your day begins with a chore list that makes modern job boards look relaxing. First on the list, getting dressed. Clothes weren't exactly breathable. They were heavy, scratchy, and mostly brown or gray. If you were lucky, the wool didn't itch too much. If you were unlucky, you got a coat that smelled like 3 other families combined. And of course, washing them was a rare luxury. So most days, your outfit smelled like a combination of last week's chores and, well, medieval life. Breakfast was interesting. Sometimes it was porridge, sometimes bread, sometimes just whatever hadn't spoiled yet. And by spoiled, I mean you probably shouldn't eat it, but hunger is persuasive. Honey was a treat, but sugar was almost mythical. And salt? Salt was basically gold. You would sprinkle it carefully, like a wizard casting a spell, because one wrong pinch could ruin the entire meal. And yes, everyone ate with their hands. Forks were for nobles, and knives were mostly used for hunting or occasionally defending yourself from your neighbor's dog. Now let's float over to the workday. Fields, farms, and forests were your office, and the boss was nature itself. Crops had to be planted, watered, and harvested, usually in all weather conditions. Rain, too bad. Sun, too hot. Mud, constant. And because medieval tools weren't exactly ergonomic, every task involved some level of back-breaking labor. A peasant's life was basically a non-stop physical therapy session, only without any actual therapy. The day wasn't all manual labor, though. There were plenty of social obligations. If your neighbor was getting married, you had to attend. If the Lord was holding court, you had to bring a gift or risk being forgotten. And if someone sneezed too loudly, there was a good chance it would be blamed on something entirely unrelated, but extremely inconvenient. Hygiene was minimal. People washed when it was really necessary, which in practice meant rarely. Baths were often taken in large wooden tubs, sometimes shared, sometimes heated, and occasionally with herbs if you were fancy. But mostly it was a quick rinse, a sigh of relief, and back to work. Hair? Combed, maybe. Teeth? Mostly ignored. And smell, let's just say medieval perfume was a polite suggestion, not a requirement. Let's drift back to the elite for a moment, just to keep things balanced. The nobles had their quirks too. Fancy meals, elaborate clothing, and long grooming rituals. But don't get the idea it was relaxing. Some of them obsessed over trivial things. One countess reportedly refused to wear shoes made in a village, because why not? And kings could spend hours ensuring their dinners were perfectly symmetrical, because chaos was terrifying to someone with too much power and too much free time. Even leisure was odd. Peasants had simple entertainment, singing, storytelling, or watching a traveling juggler if one happened to visit. Nobles had tournaments, but only the ones who didn't break a limb. And games? Mostly dice, chess, and arguments about whose horse was better. Excitement, if you could call it that, was always low stakes, but in a very, very real way. By mid-afternoon, fatigue set in. Back-breaking labor, poor food, and the constant anxiety of, did I plant enough? Did I offend the Lord? Will the goat eat my lunch? All started to weigh down the body and mind. And yet, people kept going. Because survival. And maybe because complaining out loud could lead to worse outcomes. Dinner was a modest affair. Porridge, some bread, maybe a piece of cheese if fortune smiled. And yes, water was the main beverage. Ale was common, especially for adults, because water was, let's say, experimental at best. And the night would slowly creep in, along with the hope that no rats invaded your bedding, because medieval sleep was basically a gentle negotiation with pests. So as we drift toward evening, we see a rhythm: work, eat, avoid danger, repeat. Life was simple, slow, and exhausting. And maybe that's why it makes such perfect bedtime content. Because when you realize that surviving the day involved mostly mud, chores, and minor disasters, your modern inconveniences start to feel pleasantly trivial.
Now, let's drift gently into the part of the day that everyone technically looks forward to, even in the Middle Ages: meals. And by looks forward to, I mean finally a reason to stop digging in mud for a few minutes. Dinner, or lunch, depending on how your village arranged things, was simple, repetitive, and often a little questionable. For peasants, the mainstay was porridge. Not the fancy oatmeal you have now with maple syrup and berries. This was watery, grain-based porridge, occasionally flavored with whatever herbs happened to grow nearby. Salt was a rare treat, and butter even rarer. Sometimes, if you were lucky, you could scavenge a piece of cheese or some dried fruit. Mostly, though, it was soft, grayish, and filling enough to keep your stomach quiet while you returned to the mud. Bread was everywhere, though. Coarse, tough bread that required actual jaw work to eat. You didn't chew lightly. You chewed like your life depended on it. Because in some sense, it kind of did. And if you were really lucky, you had grains that were unspoiled, which was basically a miracle. Some days, you dip your bread into ale or water, mostly because beverages were part of the daily routine and, well, it softened the bread. Now, floating gently to the noble's table, the contrast is noticeable, but still understated. Yes, they had fancier ingredients and more variety, but it wasn't like a modern feast.
Most meals involved meats, roasted, boiled, or occasionally slightly overcooked. Bread was softer, sometimes enriched with eggs or milk, and sauces were considered a mark of sophistication, often thick, brown, and applied with subtle artistry. But even here, presentation mattered more than actual taste. A noble might spend hours arranging their plate so that the gravy didn't accidentally touch the mashed root vegetables at the wrong angle. And of course, social rules dictated how meals were eaten. You didn't just grab a spoon and dig in. No, every gesture was observed, evaluated, and sometimes noted in a ledger of etiquette that could rival your modern tax forms for complexity. Forks were mostly absent, so the hands did the heavy lifting. Napkins were more for showing that you owned them than for actual cleaning, and spills were quietly ignored unless they were spectacularly public. Peasant meals had a rhythm of their own. Early morning porridge, mid-morning snack, if there was anything, and then whatever could be found at noon. Dinner was often identical to breakfast, just slightly colder. And yet, people adapted. Humans are resilient like that. They developed subtle rituals, tapping the spoon 3 times before eating, passing bread in a clockwise rotation, or making sure the goat didn't get too close. Small, simple routines that gave a sense of control in otherwise muddy, unpredictable lives. And as we float over to the nobles again, life was marginally more structured. Banquets were held with gentle ceremony, cups of ale or wine were passed, small talk happened in subdued tones, and someone somewhere was probably making sure the roast didn't look too sad. Conversation topics were often repetitive: the weather, the crops, whose horse ran fastest last week. But it was enough to pass the time, and in a calm, measured way, it made people feel that life had a rhythm. Now, one particularly gentle quirk of medieval life was the obsession with pets. Yes, even peasants occasionally had dogs, cats, or chickens that doubled as companions in minor security. Nobles, of course, took it further. Dogs were pampered, cats had special resting mats, and some had exotic birds that chirped in precisely the wrong place at the wrong time, adding a subtle soundtrack to the quiet monotony of daily life. Pets were a kind of comfort, a reminder that, despite the mud, the chores, and the odd diet, there was still something soft in your life. Evening meals were another exercise in routine. Peasants gathered around a small fire, slowly chewing their bread or sipping whatever liquid they had on hand. The conversation was minimal: complaints about chores, updates on the weather, occasional observations about the neighbors' habits. Nobles, meanwhile, had slightly more structured meals, though still mild and repetitive. A soft clink of a spoon, a gentle exchange of pleasantries, and then a slow drift toward the next part of the day: rest. And this, of course, brings us to one of the most calming aspects of medieval life: routine. Days, meals, chores, and even quirks repeated with almost hypnotic regularity. If you were a peasant, you knew that after eating, you would return to work. If you were a noble, you knew you would inspect your castle or gardens. And the monotony, strangely, created a rhythm that was almost soothing. The subtle transitions of daily life, morning chores to mid-morning meal, work to lunch, afternoon rest, and evening gathering formed a gentle loop. It wasn't exciting, it wasn't dramatic, and it wasn't particularly glamorous, but it was steady, reliable, and oddly satisfying to think about. There was a cadence to existence, even in mud and coarse bread, that makes it perfect for sleepy storytelling. And as we drift gently toward nightfall, you might notice something comforting. The world, both noble and peasant, is very small in its concerns.
Nothing huge happens, nothing unexpected, just a calm, flowing rhythm of survival, meals, minor social quirks, and the occasional awkward royal observation. Life, for all its oddities, continues. And maybe, as you listen, that's all of the excitement you need.
All right, let's drift slowly back into the world where work is life. And life is basically one long, repetitive task list. Imagine waking up in a small, slightly damp room, stretching out stiff muscles and thinking, well, not much, because thinking too much in medieval times could get exhausting. The day begins, as always, with chores that are simple in concept but surprisingly tiring in execution. The first task is usually fetching water. If you were a peasant, this meant a trek to a nearby well or stream, often carrying a heavy bucket while avoiding mud puddles that seemed to grow just to make your journey harder. The water itself could be anything from clear and refreshing to less so. But the main goal was hydration, so you carried on. This simple act was an excellent way to start the day, stretching your arms and legs before the real work began. Next comes tending to animals. Chickens needed feeding, goats needed checking, and if you had a cow, milking became a careful dance of patience and mild frustration. Animals didn't care much for schedules or moods, which meant you had to adapt. Some days the cow would be cooperative. Other days it would decide that your ankle was the best place to test gravity. And yet, through this, a rhythm developed. A gentle ebb and flow that kept life steady. Then, of course, there were the fields. Planting, harvesting, weeding, and occasionally staring at crops while hoping they'd grow faster than the weeds. Tools were simple: hoes, rakes, and wooden plows. Ergonomics was not a consideration, and still, people worked diligently, discovering subtle efficiencies in movements and routines that modern observers might call primitive, but in truth were just the slow poetry of survival. While peasants toiled, hygiene remained minimal, and here's where life gets quietly amusing. Baths were rare, washing was more ritual than practical, and hair was combed when convenient. Dirt accumulated, smells mingled with mud and sweat, and yet life went on. There was a certain elegance in these practical compromises, an understated acceptance that cleanliness was a luxury, not a requirement. Even small acts like wiping hands on a cloth before eating were considered a tiny triumph. Let's float over to the nobles again. Their work was different, though still oddly mundane in its own way. Inspecting estates, checking ledgers, overseeing gardens, and occasionally worrying about the angle of sunlight in the dining hall. These were tasks of delicate precision. It sounds tedious, but there was a subtle satisfaction in ensuring everything was just right. The nobles, like peasants, operated in a rhythm. The difference was mainly the furniture, clothing, and slightly more comfortable shoes. Social interactions and daily tasks were another gentle rhythm. Peasants greeted neighbors with short exchanges, commented on minor mishaps, and slowly moved through chores in unspoken cooperation. Nobles held quiet conversations while supervising servants, occasionally pausing to admire a well-placed hedge or a slightly overcooked roast. Everything was measured, calm, and predictable, perfect for a slow narration and ideal for a listener ready to drift into the medieval world without excitement or drama. Even the small errors of the day became part of the rhythm. A basket might tip over, a chicken might escape, or someone might spill water. These were minor setbacks, corrected without fuss, and then life continued. There's a strange comfort in this predictability. Unlike modern life, where surprises abound and deadlines loom, medieval daily tasks flowed gently from one to the next. And as afternoon drifts into evening, chores slow. Animals are fed, tools are stored,
and the day's minor victories are acknowledged in quiet satisfaction. Even the mud feels less intrusive now that the work has been done. A simple meal awaits, perhaps bread with cheese, and then the body begins to prepare for rest. The rhythm of life continues, unbroken, soothing in its repetitiveness.